Good afternoon, teachers. Today's video lesson plan is going to cover a lesson that I do out of Unit 3B on the Phillips curve. Just a brief note before we get started, different teachers tend to teach this lesson in different points along the curriculum. So you'll notice that the Phillips curve is module 34 of your textbook. That is absolutely not where I like to teach it. I teach the Phillips curve as an addendum to the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model for reasons that I think will be pretty obvious in just a second why I like to do that. You don't necessarily have to teach it here, but I feel like this is logically the best place to put it. So I would highly recommend not waiting until module 34 in order to cover this content. In addition, if you were super motivated, you can actually introduce the Phillips curve alongside GDP, inflation, and unemployment in the previous unit, although I think that's a little bit early because they won't be able to draw parallels between the Phillips curve and aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So I teach it here in Unit 3B, but that's not a hard and fast rule. You can kind of place it wherever works best for you. But this is where I do it, so I'm going to run through the lesson plan of how I go about covering this particular model. I think it's one of the easier ones that we ask the kids to know. And I'll generally cover this entire lesson in about 90 minutes. So usually there's one class period or 45 minutes worth of instruction with regards to what does the curve look like, how do we go about manipulating it, and then after that I'll usually do one full day of Phillips curve practice because for some reason students tend to think the Phillips curve makes an awful lot of sense when you're explaining it to them, but then when you ask them to actually draw it and manipulate the data, they tend to have a little bit more difficulty with that. So I tend to spend at least one full 45-minute class period making them manipulate that data to make sure that they've kind of connected the dots between the aggregate supply curves and the Phillips curve. So taking a look at slide number 1, we're going to run through the short run Phillips curve and we're going to talk about shifts in the short run. Then for slide number 2, we're going to do an introduction to the long run Phillips curve and talk about long run shifts along with shifts in the natural rate of unemployment. Slide number 3 is going to cover movements along the short run Phillips curve, and then we'll wrap it up with a brief discussion of the effects of anticipated inflation on the Phillips curve, because that's actually a determinant here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we start talking about the short run Phillips curve proper, let's take a look at the two axes on this graph, because I think understanding the relationships between the axes is going to be really important. So what I have drawn for you here is an aggregate supply aggregate demand model next to the Phillips curve, because these two models are related to each other, which is the reason why I like to teach the Phillips curve in this unit. So taking a look at the y-axis, you'll see that on the aggregate supply aggregate demand model, the y-axis is covering price level, which is going to be measured in terms of price index. Hopefully students remember that from Unit 2. And the y-axis of the Phillips curve is measuring the inflation rate as a percentage. Well, the inflation rate as a percentage is just another way of going about describing what's happening to the aggregate price level. And so you'll see them boxed in green here. The price level on the aggregate supply aggregate demand model should have a direct relationship with the inflation rate on the y-axis of the Phillips curve. So if price level is rising, another name for the aggregate price level going up is inflation. And vice versa. And so what this should mean in practice is that the up and down movement of the Phillips curve should mirror the up and down movement of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. So if you know the determinants of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and you're able to manipulate that graph, you should automatically know what's happening to the inflation rate on the Phillips curve. Taking a look at the x-axis, you'll notice they're boxed in red over here. The reason being that the x-axes of these have an inverse relationship to each other. So the x-axis of the ASAD model is tracking real GDP or real productivity, whereas the x-axis of the Phillips curve is tracking the unemployment rate as a percentage. The students theoretically should know at this point that productivity and the unemployment rate have an inverse relationship with each other. So as the economy becomes more productive, we hire more workers to produce additional products, and the unemployment rate falls. So what this means in practice is that essentially the Phillips curve isn't really giving us any new information above and beyond what we could infer from the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. It's merely representing information that we already knew in a more effective way. So it's not really a model in and of itself, but kind of an addendum to aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So in practice, what this means is that the Phillips curve is essentially the mirror image of the short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply curves. Because we've kept the y-axis, the up and down axis, constant and inverted the x-axis, all we're going to be doing is the opposite on the Phillips curve of whatever's happening on aggregate supply, which I think makes this a whole lot easier to understand, because that means the Phillips curve doesn't really have its own set of unique determinants. Its determinants are the determinants of the long-run and short-run aggregate supply curves. So if the students don't know their short-run and long-run determinants at this point, now they're going to get two separate sets of questions wrong on the test. So make sure that they have memorized their determinants. That is absolutely not optional. So taking a look at the short-run Phillips curve in relation to the short-run aggregate supply curve, what you'll see here is that the short-run aggregate supply curve is describing a positive relationship. It's got an upward sloping curve, showing that as the aggregate price level increases, we tend to see short-run increases in our GDP, or short-run increases in real productivity. And hopefully the students will remember that the reason that we see these short-run increases due to higher prices is because as wages are sticky in the short run and prices rise, what we see is a reduction in real wages, which is good for producers and causes them to overproduce. So basically we're able to exploit the workers just a little bit because they haven't noticed their real wages are falling. And by exploiting the workers just a little bit, we're able to squeeze extra productivity out of every dollar we pay them. What you'll see on the short-run Phillips curve, however, is basically the opposite relationship here. So the short-run Phillips curve is downward sloping, showing an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. And this is particularly important with regard to fiscal policy because this helps us to understand why there's a short-run trade-off between changes in the inflation rate and changes in the unemployment rate. And that's going to be important for fiscal policy because the policies we create to lower unemployment are going to cause inflation, and the policies we create to lower inflation are going to cause unemployment. So what we're seeing is essentially the same relationship along the short-run Phillips curve, but because we've inverted the x-axis and now we're looking for the unemployment rate as opposed to real GDP, it ends up with a downward sloping curve as opposed to an upward sloping curve. The up and down is going to be the same, but the left and right is going to be opposite here. So the short-run Phillips curve's determinants are the determinants of short-run aggregate supply, those being changes in commodity prices, changes in overall productivity, changes in the regulatory environment, changes in nominal wages. We could also throw in here changes in inflation rates or anticipated inflation. But long story short, the important thing the students need to leave with is that changes in the short-run aggregate supply curve are reflected opposite on the short-run Phillips curve. So any of these determinants are going to cause a positive short-run supply shock. They're going to cause a negative shock on the Phillips curve and vice versa. So the easy way for the kids to remember this is that when short-run aggregate supply goes left, Phillips curve goes right. And when short-run aggregate supply goes right, the Phillips curve goes left. That's kind of the easiest way for them to understand that. So moving forward, let's take a look at the long-run Phillips curve, which gives us some additional information above and beyond what we were able to get from ASAD. Moving on from the short-run Phillips curve, we're now going to move on to a discussion of the long-run Phillips curve. A lot of what we said about the short-run Phillips curve is going to apply here as well. But there's a couple of additional pieces of information that we can glean from the long-run Phillips curve that we didn't necessarily get from the short run. So let's take a look at similarities and differences here. So looking at the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, you'll see that I have long-run aggregate supply drawn here. And long-run aggregate supply, you may recall, shows that there is no long-run relationship between changes in the aggregate price level and changes in real productivity. And that's because in the long run, we presume that workers' wages are perfectly flexible. And if workers' wages are perfectly flexible, then increases in the price level are met with increases in their nominal wages, and you never see that slow erosion of real wages the way that we do in the short run. And so producers never get to squeeze any extra productivity out of their workers per dollar in the long run, whereas in the short run they were able to do so. And since they're not squeezing that extra productivity per dollar out of their workers, you never see the short-term increases in our GDP that would result from changes in the price level in the short run. We don't see those changes in the long run. Now, the long-run Phillips curve is also showing no relationship, but in this case it's showing no relationship between the rate of inflation and the rate of unemployment in the long run. So with perfectly flexible wages, there's basically no trade-off between inflation rates and unemployment rates. Just like in the long run, there's no trade-off between changes in price level and changes in our GDP or real productivity. So the long run Phillips curve is essentially just a different version of the long run aggregate supply curve, which in its own way is kind of just the macro version of the production possibilities curve that we introduced at the very beginning of the course. So all of these concepts are really closely related to each other. And because of that, the determinants of all three of the models are the same as each other. So your determinants of the long run aggregate supply curve were changes in the quantity of resources available, changes in the quality of resources available, and changes in productive technology. And those are also the determinants of the production possibilities curve, and now we know that they're going to be the determinants of the long run Phillips curve as well. Keeping in line with the changes that happened in the short run, the long run Phillips curve is going to have the opposite effect that the long run aggregate supply curve does. So taking a look at our long run aggregate supply curve, if we have better productive technology, that'll result in a rightward shift of long run aggregate supply, but a leftward shift in the long run Phillips curve. So just like in the short run, our shocks here, are going to be the opposite for the Phillips curve of what they were for aggregate supply and aggregate demand. The reason, once again, being that we have inverted the x-axis here. So our GDP and unemployment have an inverse relationship, and because of that, what was left on one model is going to be right on the other, even though we're essentially showing the same thing. Now, taking a look at what I've written here in green, we also have a couple of additional pieces of information that are super important that we can get from the long-run Phillips curve. So you may recall that the point where the long-run aggregate supply curve intersected with the x-axis we called YP or YF, meaning potential GDP or GDP at full employment. And on the Phillips curve, since we've got the unemployment rate on the x-axis, the point where the long-run Phillips curve intersects with the x-axis is the point where we have is basically the full employment rate of unemployment. And you may recall from Unit 2 that the full employment rate of unemployment is also known as the natural rate of unemployment, which is essentially the sum of structural unemployment and frictional unemployment in the economy. You'll also notice the AP exam tends to label this NARU as opposed to NRU. NARU and NRU are the same thing for the purposes of this course. They can use those terms relatively interchangeably. But NARU stands for the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. It's essentially the rate of unemployment that when we drop below that rate, you start to see demand pull inflation show up in the economy. But we can just interchange that term with natural rate of unemployment. Just make sure the kids know the AP exam tends to label that NARU, and don't let that throw them off. They should know what that means. And so what we see here that's actually kind of interesting is that shocks in the long run Phillips curve actually change the economy's natural rate of unemployment. So when our economy becomes more productive due to more resources or more technology or better resources, we can actually result in a leftward shift in the long run Phillips curve and having a current natural rate of unemployment that's lower than it used to be. So the natural rate, although it's the full employment rate of unemployment, it does change over time. And one of the ways we're going to be able to track those changes over time are by looking at shifts in the long run Phillips curve. So in short, anything that causes long-run aggregate supply to experience a shock changes the natural rate of unemployment to some degree, and that's a good piece of information for the students to have. Moving on, let's talk about what happens when there are shifts in aggregate demand on the Phillips curve. Moving on to slide 3, we're going to talk about what happens to the Phillips curve when there are shifts in the aggregate demand curve. So what I've done here is for the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, I've gone ahead and put long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand together so that you can see equilibrium. And on the Phillips curve, I've combined the long-run Phillips curve along with the short-run Phillips curve. Now you may recall from color coding that the short-run Phillips curve is basically the short-run aggregate supply curve, but it shifts in the opposite direction. And the long-run Phillips curve is basically just the long-run aggregate supply curve that shifts in the opposite direction. What is interesting is that the Phillips curve doesn't have a third curve on the model. So there's an equivalent for long-run aggregate supply and an equivalent for short-run aggregate supply, but there is no aggregate demand equivalent on the Phillips curve. And this is really, I think, the only thing that leads to some confusion amongst the students. Because what that means is, since aggregate demand is on the ASAD model but not on the Phillips curve, it leads us to scenarios where if the economy is operating in short-run equilibrium, which we are the vast majority of the time, then the equilibrium point on the Phillips curve is not going to be at the intersection of the long-run and short-run Phillips curve. So you see over here the equilibrium point labeled E2 on the Phillips curve side is just kind of floating out there by itself. That's totally acceptable for this model, but this is the only model for AP Macro where the equilibrium point doesn't occur at the intersection of two curves. And I think that throws students off as well. It should, because it's a little bit weird. It violates the rules of most of the other models that we've introduced. But the important piece of information here is that aggregate demand is still there, even though you can't see it on the Phillips curve. And so shifts in aggregate demand, you'll notice on the ASAD model, are creating movements along the short-run aggregate supply curve. So in our ASAD model here, our shift from AD1 to AD2 caused a movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, and that these movements will be reflected once again in the opposite direction along the short-run Phillips curve. So the rightward movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve results in a leftward movement along the short-run Phillips curve, and that leftward movement is being caused by shifts in aggregate demand. So to kind of pull all of this together, shifts in short-run aggregate supply cause shifts in the short-run Phillips curve. Shifts in long-run aggregate supply cause shifts in the long-run Phillips curve, and shifts in aggregate demand cause movements along the short-run Phillips curve, but not shifts. And so once again, our determinants of aggregate demand are going to be the things that will cause movement along the Phillips curve, including changes to the stock of physical capital, changes to consumers' expectations for the future, changes in consumer net worth or overall wealth, and changes in fiscal and or monetary policy. So there's nothing really all that different happening over here, with the exception that the movements are going to create situations where equilibrium points are kind of floating off by themselves on the short-run Phillips curve. That's the only thing that's a little weird. I found that once you show the students what that looks like and tell them that it's okay for E2 to be off over there by itself, they tend to not have too much difficulty with this, although they're a little bit resistant to putting equilibrium points in places other than the intersection of curves. All right, teachers, and wrapping up our lesson on the short-run and long-run Phillips curves, we need to have a brief discussion of something the AP exam occasionally asks about. It's not super common, but it does come up, and that's the impact of expected inflation on the short-run Phillips curve, or what's sometimes called anticipated inflation. And it turns out that regardless of what the actual rate of inflation is at any given time, anticipated inflation or expected inflation actually can shift the short-run Phillips curve all on its own. Because if people think the inflation rate's going to be, 2% higher than it is today, that creates a whole lot of changes in the economy. So, for example, banks will raise nominal interest rates to accommodate for that additional 2%. Or businesses will take into account the fact that they need to earn 2% higher return on investment when deciding whether or not to invest in long-term projects. And so what we see is anticipated inflation in the macroeconomy is essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people believe that higher inflation rates are coming, then we kind of get used to those inflationary expectations being higher, and this will actually cause an upward shift of the short-run Phillips curve, as evidenced in my drawing here from equilibrium point 1 to equilibrium point 2. So so anticipated inflation actually drives the real inflation rate to some degree. And this was kind of an important discovery of the last 50 years here in macroeconomics. So if I believe hard enough and enough other people agree with me that inflation's going to go up, we actually cause inflation to go up, tying back into kind of those animal spirits that John Maynard Keynes talked about. Conversely, if I believe that inflation is going to fall going in the future, the banks will lower nominal interest rates, businesses will become a little bit more lenient with the types of expected returns they're willing to invest into, and what will end up resulting is the overall inflation rate in the economy will fall, as evidenced from our shift from equilibrium point 1 to equilibrium point 3. So essentially, it's pretty straightforward. So if the AP exam asks a question about this, it should kind of be a freebie. If people think that inflation's going to go up, it goes up. And if people think inflation's going to go down, then it goes down. So in addition to the determinants of the short-run aggregate supply curve that we talked about, changes in anticipated inflation also will cause shifts in the short-run Phillips curve. And so in this case, up if we think that inflation is going to be higher, and down if we think that inflation is going to be lower. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you've got any questions, you know where to find me. Have a great day.